The Beatles made some of the greatest albums ever recorded, but they also made some pretty weird choices. Across their career, they left out incredible songs off albums, buried them on B sides, or released them months later as singles. And sometimes, well, the songs they chose instead weren't just as good. So today we're going album by album, replacing at least one track with a Beatles song that I think would have made the record even stronger. Now, obviously, this is all opinion based. I'm not saying these albums are bad, far from it, of course. Most of them are classics, but it is fun, isn't it? To imagine the alternate versions of Beatles history and the albums that might have been. So let's go ahead and fix the discography. Starting off, of course, we've got the Beatles' debut album, Please Please Me, an album that's basically an example of raw energy and power being recorded onto tape. You know, short space of time to record the material, and it produces what I think is pretty electrifying, album. It's a "We're Here" statement. Um, but honestly, if I could replace a song on that album, it would have to be "A Taste of Honey," because to be honest, I do think that song does somewhat slow the momentum of the album down. And in its place, I would probably pick "From Me to You." You know, that song was released as a single just after this album, but honestly, it would have fit perfectly here, I think. The harmonies are stronger for one thing, the hook's unforgettable, and it captures early Beatlemania far better than almost anything else from 1963. And I think it would have made the album feel even more confident and indeed original. Also from 1963, of course, is With the Beatles. Now, this album has some great moments, but it's also packed with covers. So I've got to say, I'd replace Little Child with She Loves You. Now, honestly, it's kind of insane that one of the biggest songs in music history wasn't really on a Beatles studio album. I know, sounds crazy. She Loves You would have instantly given this record more punch and make side one almost unstoppable like a freight train. Plus, that yeah energy completely defines this era of the band. Now, of course, we have the first of two soundtrack albums, I guess, unless you're counting Magical Mystery Tour, and that is, of course, from 1964, A Hard Day's Night. This album is quite difficult, really, to sort of pick a song that maybe you could replace, because it is quite consistent. But if I did have to make a choice, I would remove "I'll Cry Instead" with "I Feel Fine." "I Feel Fine," of course, has one of the most iconic openings in Beatles history, that with that feedback, of course, and sonically it points towards the more advanced studio experimentation they'd later become famous for. And it would also, I would argue, make an already strong soundtrack album feel even bigger and more dynamic. Also from 1964, of course, we have Beatles for Sale. Wow. Now, this album, you can really tell and hear the exhaustion setting in. You know, the Beatles were touring constantly at this time, and the album feels more tired and reflective. Um, I would probably change on this one. To be honest, I would swap Mr. Moonlight, definitely not a favourite, I've got to be honest, with She's a Woman. I think that track has way more attitude and energy, and McCartney's vocal on it is absolutely blisteringly fantastic. It also balances the moodier atmosphere of the album with something more dynamic and aggressive. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because of course we've got now Help, the second soundtrack album of the film of the same name. And I replace, firstly, Dizzy Miss Lizzy with We Can Work It Out. And honestly, this feels like a massive missed opportunity for this album. Yesterday had already showed how emotionally mature the Beatles had become, and we could work it out, would have strengthened that transition and even cemented it, I reckon, even more so. Meanwhile, Dizzy Miss Lizzy feels like the band looking backward instead of forward. From 1965, of course, we have Revolver. A lot of people think Rubber Soul is perfect. I almost agree, but I'd still replace Run for Your Life with Day Tripper. Day Tripper has that incredible riff tied to songwriting and a cooler overall sound. And thematically, it fits the sharper, more mature direction of Rubber Soul better than a song that John Lennon himself would later criticise. That one substitution might actually make this album flawless. Okay, this is the controversial one, and that, of course, is a Revolver from 1966, the one with the awesome, absolutely epic, cool cover. Now, controversial because Revolver seems untouchable, but can you imagine if Yellow Submarine had actually been replaced with Paperback Writer? Suddenly this album becomes even more sonically unified. You've got Paperback Writer with obviously the thick harmonies, experimental production, and the psychedelic edge that perfectly matches Tomorrow Never Knows and indeed Rain, which I think, honestly, should have also been on Revolver. Now we come to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band from 1967. This is probably the Beatles' biggest what ifs ever. What if Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane had actually been on Sgt. Pepper? George Martin reportedly later said that leaving them off the album was one of his biggest regrets. And you know what? I think he's probably right. Staying with 1967, of course, we have Magical Mystery Tour. Now, depending on where you live, of course, Magical Mystery Tour is either an EP, an album, or a weird hybrid. But if we treated it, for argument's sake, as an album, I would replace Flying with Lady Madonna. Flying is fine as an instrumental experiment, but Lady Madonna adds stronger songwriting and gives Paul another unforgettable vocal performance. And to be honest, it would also bridge the psychedelic era with the more grounded sound the Beatles were heading towards. Would have been a good opener for that, really. 2, 3. Now, the album that's probably the hardest to fix, of course, is the White Album from 1968, because chaos is kind of the point. But still, I would remove Wild Honey Pie and I would put in its place Hey Jude. Yes, it's long, it dominates everything, but can you imagine hearing Hey Jude emerge somewhere in the middle of the White Album? It actually fits surprisingly well emotionally. The White Album constantly jumps between intimacy, experimentation, beauty, and indeed madness, and Hey Jude has all of that. Yellow Submarine, from 1969. Well, I think this is an easy one because half the album isn't even Beatles songs. So let's replace the entire orchestral. 1, 2, 3. Right, 1969's Yellow Submarine. This is an easy one, I think. Half the album isn't even Beatles songs. So let's replace the whole orchestral material with Don't Let Me Down. Problem solved. That song is way too good to be hidden as a B-side. Lennon's vocals unbelievable, and it perfectly captures the emotional rawness of the late Beatles era. Now, of course, 1969 heralds Abbey Road. Now, Abbey Road, of course, already feels like the perfect farewell, but I still would make one change. Now, as much as I do like this song, and I know some people absolutely hate it, Anyway, I would still replace Maxwell's Silverhammer with Old Brown Shoe. George Harrison was on fire during this period, and Old Brown Shoe deserves a bigger spotlight. I've always thought it's a great song. It also fits the sleek, polished sound of Abbey Road better than Paul's intentionally goofy musical style track. And honestly, giving George another major album moment would have made the record even stronger. Finally, of course, we have Let It Be from 1970. This album, I think, has always felt unfinished, to be honest. So my change would be replacing Dig It with Across the Universe. Now, technically, of course, Across the Universe is already on the album, but I would use the earlier, cleaner version instead of the heavily produced Phil Spector mix. The song deserves to shine without all of the extra orchestration. It's one of Lennon's most beautiful compositions, and it would have added a more reflective ending to the Beatles' story, in my own opinion. Right. Anyway, the weird thing about the Beatles is that their leftovers became classics anyway, of course. They would, wouldn't they? Most bands would kill to write one song like Rain or Don't Let Me Down, and the Beatles were casually leaving songs like that off albums. But that's also why fans still debate these records decades later, like me. So now I want to hear your choices. Which Beatles songs should have replaced album tracks? Which swaps would have improved the albums, do you think? And which ones would have ruined them? Drop your opinions in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, of course, like, subscribe, and maybe I'll do the same thing for solo Beatles albums next. So, take care, guys. Don't be down. See ya.